An extraordinary new development in President Trump's push to take over Greenland as European leaders meet to discuss an emergency response to his new tariff threat. The president sent a letter to Norway's prime minister. According to a diplomat who's seen the note, he wrote in part, quote, "Dear Jonas, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America." CNN's Melissa Bell joins us live from Paris this morning. The Prime Minister of Norway now saying, yeah, that's the letter I got from President Trump talking about the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a pretty remarkable development.
It's a remarkable tone that struck in that letter, dear Jonas, that fit of pique almost at not having received the Nobel Peace Prize, used as justification for all that we've seen over the course of the weekend. And that is, John, this extraordinary ratcheting up of this pressure on Europe to try and force them essentially to hand over or sell Greenland to the United States, which is an extraordinary turn of events that now tariffs should be being used at this particular moment to try and exert pressure on Europe. And that timing is really unfortunate, John, for a number of reasons. First of all, because in front of European lawmakers was due this week the very deal that was signed last summer to avert a trade war between the United States and Europe, the trade deal that sets American tariffs at 15% and that prevents the European Union from imposing levies on the United States. What we understand now is that European lawmakers are not going to pass that deal as a result of these renewed threats of fresh tariffs on European Union countries. What that means is that if the deal is not agreed upon, the retaliatory 93 billion euro worth of European counter tariffs that had been threatened at the time before the deal was reached would come into effect in February. So really what you're seeing is the European Union preparing to answer very forcefully after a great deal of outrage expressed over the course of the last couple of days as a result of these renewed threats. The reimposition, therefore, of retaliatory tariffs being prepared even now by the European Commission, even though officially what we've heard this morning from the Commission spokesman, John, is that Europe is looking for de-escalation. They're looking for compromise, dialogue and negotiation, even as they prepare for these very forceful tactics. And beyond the imposition of these frozen retaliatory tariffs lies the possibility of what's been described as the bazooka option. This is the Europeans' anti-coercion tool, which would see an even greater number of limits placed on the United States' access to European markets. So a ratcheting up of the pressure, but a ratcheting up as well of the response, even as negotiation is sought, John.
Yeah, talking in ways they really just haven't before. Melissa Bell in Paris this morning. Thank you. With us now is retired Major General James Spider-Marks, our friend. He is the head of geopolitical strategy at Academy Securities. And Spider, how does something like this land overseas? All these European leaders now and officials have been meeting, trying to figure out how to deal with the United States on this issue. And then they see this letter about the Nobel Peace Prize to the Prime Minister of Norway.
Yeah, it doesn't land very well. I mean, when you look at policies like this, or at least moving in this direction, the potential of embracing some type of a policy, I think many would say why it's being done makes sense. The United States needs to, should have a much more enhanced relationship with Greenland, albeit we have one established in 1951, an agreement that allows the United States to have military access, and it kind of essentially, in my terms, provides cooperation between those two, one autonomous nation or autonomous entity to Denmark and the United States. So that can be identified and say, yeah, this is a good deal. But when you look at how the president in this administration is addressing the possibility of enhancing that gets very problematic. And
European leaders outraged this morning over President Trump's latest move in his bid for control of Greenland. President Trump threatening a 10% tariff on 8 European countries that oppose his play to seize the Arctic island. Denmark's prime minister saying in response, quote, Europe won't be blackmailed. And there's a new twist this morning with the Norwegian prime minister's office releasing a text message President Trump sent yesterday tying his moves on Greenland to his Nobel Peace Prize snub. Let's bring in MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Joel Rubin. Good to see you both. David, let's start with the new tariff threats. Can the president do this? What is the legal justification for these new tariffs?
So there's a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that the president has cited here. He's used this, invoked this to launch this whole tariff war that he started many months ago. It's right now being considered by the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's unclear if the Supreme Court will sort of come out and decisively say he doesn't have this power. The legal question is there an emergency happening right now? And so yesterday in an interview on NBC News, Secretary Scott Bessent tried to describe the legal rationale for this. Have a listen.
The national emergency is avoiding a national emergency. That it is a strategic decision by the president. This is a geopolitical decision, and he is able to use the economic might of the U.S. to avoid a hot war. So why wouldn't we do that? You know, same thing. That what if that we had a national emergency coming with these gigantic trade balances that we had with the rest of the world? I've been in financial markets for 30, 45 years. Much better to be strategic, avoid the emergency.
So what's extraordinary there is that there's no indication that there's an emergency here.
Right. What's the imminent threat?
So Russia is not threatening to invade Greenland. Russia invaded Ukraine and has its hands full there. The people have invoked China. A European official said a few days ago that there's been no Chinese ships near Greenland for years. So it's again a theme of this presidency. The president having the sweeping power to just unilaterally announce these tariffs, not relying on Congress in so many ways. But the key issue here is just the facts. There isn't any emergency national security threat. I've talked to members of Congress, intelligence officials. There is no imminent Russian invasion of Greenland. This is all seems to be being created by the president so he can buy Greenland. And then lastly, it's just basic democracy. Don't the residents of Greenland get to decide what country they live in versus this just being bought by another nation?
And not to mention, it's a NATO ally.
If it was invaded, all NATO allies would have to defend Greenland.
We're also learning this morning, Joel, that President Trump sent a message to Norway's prime minister, his office releasing a message that said, quote, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars, plus I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. That's apparently what President Trump sent to Norway. And this now has reached out to the White House. In response, Norway's prime minister explained that the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded by an independent committee, not the Norwegian government. So he's threatening tariffs, blaming not getting a Nobel Prize. What's your reaction to this?
Anna, look, this just frankly exposes the whole truth of this whole discussion, which is that Greenland for Donald Trump is nothing more than a vanity project. It is not a national security issue, to David's point. To your point about imminent threat, look, this reminds me of Iraq, when we had Condoleezza Rice going on TV saying, we don't want to be the victims of a mushroom cloud, a nuclear weapon going off. Therefore, we need to invade Iraq. So therefore, we don't want at some point down the road, Russia or China to take Greenland. Therefore, we need to essentially raise prices on Americans and raise their costs by enacting sanctions against our allies in order to prevent something that may happen down the road. So it's really offensive. It counters logic. And it demonstrates once again that the whole Greenland policy is nothing more than a vanity project.
NATO's Secretary General said he spoke with President Trump about Greenland. He looks forward to seeing him in Davos this week, where they believe Greenland will be a major issue. We've also learned today NATO and the Secretary General's meeting with Danish and Greenlandic officials. Joel, what is this doing to the NATO alliance? Has damage already been done?
It's shredding it. And, this is like a dream scenario for Vladimir Putin. He could not have mapped this out better. The script from Moscow has been followed exquisitely. The idea that an American president would essentially be threatening another NATO member ally in Denmark, causing our other allies in France and Britain and Germany and others to be scared for their country's future.
At first, honestly, I was skeptical, and I'll admit I was. It's not that I thought, oh, Donald Trump would never do something like this. You should never assume there's a line he won't cross. There's no real rock bottom with him. There just isn't. But when I first heard that he allegedly wrote a letter suggesting he might still invade Greenland, partly because he didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize, and therefore didn't feel obligated to act like a peaceful person, it sounded almost too on the nose, like satire, except it turns out it actually happened, and the timeline makes it even more bizarre. Trump didn't win the Nobel Prize. It went to a woman from Venezuela instead. Not long after that, Venezuela was invaded, and Trump made it clear he didn't want this woman put in charge. Now, yes, there are constitutional and practical reasons for that. There's already a vice president, and it's easier to follow the established line of succession. I understand that part, but his rejection didn't seem driven by practicality as much as resentment. She won the Nobel Prize, and he didn't, and he appeared jealous. So this woman, seemingly trying to appease Trump, traveled to Washington and, in her own mind, formally handed the prize over to him. She literally gave him the medal, the physical symbol of the award. But the Nobel Prize Committee quickly shut that down. The judges made it clear that's not how this works. A Nobel laureate doesn't have the authority to give their prize to someone else. At most, they can return it and refuse the honor, but they cannot reassign it to Donald Trump. After all of this, after Trump received the medal, after the committee said he wasn't entitled to it, and after the judges demanded it be returned, that's when he made the threat. That's the sequence of events. And I get that it sounds absurd. I know he had already been talking about Greenland months earlier, even before this year's Nobel Prize was decided. I know he's had an interest in Greenland going back to his first term. All of that is true. But what really stands out is his willingness to say, in effect, if you don't give me the Peace Prize, I won't be peaceful.